Good morning. Well, you're right, there are a lot of people out here. Bonjour tout le monde, c'est un grand plaisir pour moi de vous accueillir ce matin en personne dans cette belle ville qu'est Halifax. No screens, no pajamas. The scientific studies and research of the CIMVHR Forum have continued through COVID, and nous sommes maintenant prêts à faire face à l'un des plus grands problèmes de notre génération. My name is Heather Thorne-Albright, and I have the honor of being your moderator for today's panel. It is a real privilege for me to participate in a panel on culture change. As a woman veteran with almost 40 years' experience in the military, I am quite familiar with culture change and the variety of recent catalysts that have brought it back to the forefront. Entering the Royal Military College in 1982 as only the third class of women and serving on deployments, as Yvonne said, to Russia, the former Yugoslavia, and Somalia has given me lived experience. When I met Yvonne and David earlier this summer, they explained to me that the aim of this panel was culture change. But I cautioned them that some of you here this morning may already be suffering from fatigue on this subject. And perhaps it's because we feel like we've been here before. There's skepticism that this time will be different. It needs to be more than just a checklist. During one of our brainstorming sessions, I was describing how the military loves a good checklist. We are so task-oriented. With respect to culture change, we're ready to write policy papers, have staff meetings, put up a poster, send an email, and then we want to get on with doing something else. And it became obvious to us that this time needed to be different. When we look at culture change as more than a checklist, more than a series of transactional items that we mark off and then carry on. This time needs to include attitudes, behaviors, methodologies, conversations, and more. Et tout le monde nous regarde. There is pressure on the organization to demonstrate change internally and externally. What is the responsibility of researchers to contribute to this change? If nothing changes, then nothing changes. When I enrolled in the military in 1982, Trudeau was Prime Minister, Star Wars was big in entertainment, and we didn't trust the Russians. So it kind of feels like I've been here before. Servicewomen in non-traditional and environmental roles, or SWINTER trials, Standard for Harassment and Racism Prevention, or SHARP training, Operation Honor, to name a few. But they lacked a fundamental shift in attitude and leadership, and so we're still here because nothing has changed. This is a global, complex, and systemic issue that involves more than just gender and difficult conversations. And the CAF does not have a monopoly on this situation. Nous avons appris que plusieurs organisations similaires dans d'autres pays font face à des défis similaires. We are all accountable for where we are today, and we are all responsible for how we move forward. How can we redesign research and use it as a mobilizer? When we look at research, whose voices are we amplifying and whose voices are we excluding? We were committed to progress when we were preparing for this panel, but even when we began to articulate what would successful culture change look like, our answers were all different. So I would ask you to think in the next couple days, when you're in one of the amazing workshops or having a meal with a colleague, what can you do to embody culture change in your organization or your community? Strive for progress, not perfection. I'm suggesting we aim for progress and not perfection. Even little steps can make a difference. And perhaps that's where we've fallen short in the past, because we believed we couldn't reach that final goal. But there is no finish line. Culture is always changing and adapting, and it becomes a continuous culture evolution, a journey. If we can have difficult conversations, if we can listen to each other, but I believe it begins with that first step. And speaking of first steps, let's begin by getting to know our panel. Ce matin, nous sommes reconnaissants d'avoir réuni un excellent groupe d'experts qui vont partager leurs idées. I would now ask the panelists to introduce themselves and just a brief description of their journey to this podium and this subject. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Karen Davis. How did I get to be here today is what we were asked to think about as we introduced ourselves. So after 22 years of military service and almost exactly 22 years as a civilian defense scientist, I arrived here after an initial 7 years as a non-commissioned member in the military, very tumultuous years. But in spite of that, I was able to carve out enough success to be selected to go to university and to be commissioned and become an officer. Going through an undergraduate degree here at St. Mary's University in Halifax was a game changer for me. It opened up a complete world that I just didn't know exist. I came from a working class community in southwestern Ontario, and I think this is one of the things that the military does for a lot of people. It opened up my world. But it also gave me tools to better understand some of the challenges I'd had as an NCM, and further gave me tools to start thinking about how I could understand the experiences of others as well. So coming out of that, I embarked on a career that has now been more than 30 years embedded in social science research, trying to better understand what happens to individuals within military culture. And some of that originally was research trying to understand why Indigenous members and women in particular were leaving the military at such high rates through the 1990s. After that research, as Heather mentioned, we've been through many changes, continuing to do research, trying to understand culture change through the lens of gender, diversity, and leadership, and ultimately to the position that I'm in today with the responsibility to develop a research strategy for the Chief of Professional Conduct and Culture. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Vaughn Charlton. Coming from a bit of a different perspective, I'm a civilian executive with the RCMP, and I lead our Action, Innovation, and Modernization group, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. It was a good way to find out I no longer have any pants that fit me. And also in chatting with colleagues this morning, I realized I do have some military credentials. About a number of years ago, I was a singer in a band, and we got hired to be part of a Concan tour that went to former Yugoslavia, to Kosovo, to perform for the troops. And I was an Alanis Morissette impersonator. So if you need to know the difference between the Canadian and the US military, they would get Alanis, you got me. So that was it was a wonderful experience, very formative, really interesting. So thanks. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how I arrived here. So my specialization really is in gender-based analysis plus, so intersectional analysis. I've spent most of my career with Status of Women Canada, which is now Women and Gender Equality, the Department of Women and Gender Equality, I think that's right, WAGE. I started working with law enforcement sort of over the course of developing expertise in the area of human trafficking, which about 15 years ago, really people didn't know what it was and what that meant, and so got sort of drawn into developing some training on that. Had no prior experience with police, did not even know any police, and all of a sudden was sort of on the road doing training for frontline officers. And then I did something crazy. I married an OPP officer, so that drew me in even more. And anyways, over the course of time too, working in gender-based analysis, I always had a keen interest in what was going on in the RCMP and the things that we were hearing about the RCMP. I was working with a lot of colleagues in the RCMP, and yet we knew that there were things going on. There were reports coming out signaling some really major issues. And I think as an outside observer, I looked at the responses and I just thought, I'm not buying what is being sold to me here. I think there's more that could be done. And I think sometimes it's that pressure to respond doesn't allow for that thoughtful response. And so when I got the opportunity to come to the RCMP, it's been about 5.5 years now, to start working on implementing GBA+, and I'm gonna move this, it's all right. Okay, and on culture change, I jumped at the opportunity and have been integral in trying to build a unit to really look at culture change and what does that mean and how can we respond in a way that would make people like me think, yep, they're on the right track. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maya Eichler, and I'm one of the locals, I guess, at Forum this year. So I'm from Halifax, or as it's called in Mi'kmaq, Chiboktuk, and I'm an associate professor at Mount St. Vincent University, which is one of the 3 universities co-hosting Forum this year. So at Mount St. Vincent University, I run a research center called the Center for Social Innovation and Community Engagement in Military Affairs. Our center is dedicated to military and veteran research with a special focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion issues as they relate to military service and the transition from military to civilian life. And earlier this year, April of this year, I also took on an additional task, which is to launch a new international collaborative network on transforming military cultures. I do that together with my colleague Nancy Tabor from Brock University and Tammy George from York University. And so you might see the acronym TMC around, which stands for Transforming Military Cultures. It's funded by D&D Mines, which is the funding program of D&D, which, Mines stands for Mobilizing Insight in Defense and Security. So, our network is focused on this issue of culture change. We bring together Canadian and international defense scientists, but also researchers and, military members and veterans who are working towards this goal of rethinking, reimagining, and transforming military culture. What is unique about the approach we bring to the work is that we are really trying to think about the root causes of some of the problematic aspects of culture and to do a better job at connecting the dots, from sexism and misogyny to racism and heteronormativity to sort of think about the problem of culture change in a more holistic manner. And the final thing I'll just say is that on Wednesday morning we are hosting one of the workshops, which is on culture change meets health and wellness. So I also hope to see some of you there. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chief Warrant Officer Bob McCann. I am the Command Chief for Chief Professional Conduct and Culture. 33 years of service in an organization that was built for me. I like to tell people that in life I'm left-handed, and therefore every day I understand the challenges of living in a world that's built for right-handed people. But within the organization that I'm in, I am the right-handed person. And for 31 years out of my 33 years, I did not see the challenge that were really inherent to culture, right? And when I was called upon by Lieutenant General Carignan to come and work with her team on the culture issues, upon doing research, reading, engaging with our team members, doing a lot of listening, I really got to know what the challenges were and what many of you have been facing throughout the years. And once you see it, I guess you can get to forget it. But I'm making it my duty not to forget it and see it every day so that I can make sure everybody sees it and we can change it. Right? It's just that important. So happy to be here, happy to have the conversation because culture evolution, like we called it, we need to evolve the culture of the Canadian Forces, is something that we do every day, and it's small things that we can do to make the Canadian Armed Forces better for the next generation coming up.
That's great. So my first question is for Maya and Karen. It has been said that you will not get diversity without inclusion. In your view, is the research community inclusive enough?
So I'll take that one first. So I think, things are beginning to change, but I would say no, it isn't yet diverse and inclusive enough. But I also want to kind of clarify what I mean by diverse and inclusive. So for me, diversity is about individual differences. So if we think about the research community, that would mean seeing researchers of diverse backgrounds from diverse disciplines using a variety of methodologies and working on a variety of topics. So that's what I would consider diverse research community. In terms of inclusion, I think inclusion is about whether we embrace and value those differences in backgrounds and methodological approaches and research areas. But I think we need to also go beyond that, beyond asking, is the research community inclusive enough? We need to ask, is our research inclusive enough? And this goes back to what Bob was just talking about, because we need to be aware of the fact that we're working with a particular legacy, right? So we're working in an area of research that has been designed around a particular historic norm that reflects the historic norm of the institution. And so, that is the white, male, cisgender, heterosexual military man, and we assume a civilian female spouse is attached to him and a specific number of children. And so that legacy lives on in how we also do research, not just how the institution operates. And so we even see that, I think, in, when we use phrases like military member, veteran, spouse, we're using them in a neutral way, but I think we need to be aware of the fact that that can also erase differences and make invisible specific experiences. And so I think it's important to think about how to make research itself inclusive, because inclusive research can produce and support and enable culture change. It's actually really fundamental to that goal. So adding more diverse researchers is good, but without thinking about the inclusive research community and inclusive research itself, I think we will remain, there will be limitations. And I think to really think about inclusive research, we need to also think about systemic change, not just within the institutions that we study, but within our research community. Karen?
Great. Yeah, that's great, Maya. Definitely agree with everything that Maya said. When I think about diversity, I think we've all had endless discussions about diversity and inclusion, but for me, I still go back to the mantra that diversity is about counting numbers, and inclusion is about making those numbers count. And the reason that's so important for me is because in 2009, I heard that from a very impactful speaker and researcher who had incredible passion about his research, about the research that he did around diversity, because he had lost a sister to a serial killer who was targeting ethnic women. So I think those impactful moments have a huge impact on diversity and the passion that we bring to our research. In terms of inclusion, I think as Maya has summarized, it's really about meaningful inclusion. So I think about Canada's LC initiative and the Women, Peace and Security community, and they do a lot of thinking, research, discussing around what does meaningful participation mean. So again, as Maya had indicated, we can bring in diverse researchers and we can consult people from diverse communities, but if we don't set the conditions to make sure that those conditions are meaningful, we're going to fall short of diversity. In terms of whether the community is diverse today, I would speak to my own experience within our research community in national defense. The researchers get it. There's a lot of work going on to increase diversity in their research, and there's a lot of significant contribution in that domain. We now know that everyone understands there has to be diverse sampling in our research samples. Everyone understands that the reporting has to reflect that diversity and acknowledge the limitations. What we see less often, however, is research that crosses intersectional boundaries and reflects those deeper challenges across paradigms, concepts, different perspectives. Thanks.
Awesome. That's really interesting. So for Robert and Vaughn, so we've just heard, and I mean, we know that increasing diversity and inclusion are key to culture change. What are other institutional challenges that you've observed?
Yeah, so in reflecting on this, I think I'd like to split the response into two parts. I think there's sort of the now of the organization and then how we need to be thinking about the future of our organization. So, from a diversity and inclusion lens, The way I always sort of talk about it in my world is like, yes, it's great to say we want to have diverse people come in, but then those people can't arrive, and then you give them a bunch of kit that doesn't fit them, or you put a bunch of administrative processes in to have them acquire an item that they need. And so that was a project that my team undertook, was to sort of level the. We no longer have binary gender in our uniform guides. You buy the thing that works for you. If you want a religious item or a DASTAR or those things, you no longer have to have a note from someone that says you can have it. You can just go and order it. So those are the inclusion pieces, right? We want people to feel welcome. But then I think there's also the service delivery part of it, and what does that mean for inclusion? So yes, bring in different types of people, but in many ways, like, the RCMP is turning 150 next year, right? These are old institutions built around, as we've already mentioned, like a very specific person that we wanted to hire and very specific people we didn't want to hire. And everything was built around those folks, and unpacking that, that's a long journey to do it. So I think yes, we need to do the now work to make the environments better for the people who are there. But I think in my view, which is what you're asking for here, I think there's a deeper conversation about the delivery of public safety and public health services in 2022. If we had a blank slate and we wanted to start that today, would these be the models we would come up with? Maybe not, probably not, right? We have the benefit of all the knowledge that we've gained. And so what I think, and why I'm glad to be in this room today, I think these are multidisciplinary conversations that we need to start having sort of writ large. Like, yes, the RCMP, we need to make some changes and fix, but we cannot fix that ourselves in terms of what are the diverse needs of communities in the public safety space and how those intersect in the public health space. So, as much as we can do things now, I think there's a broader dialogue, and our job is to be willing to be meaningfully part of that dialogue going forward.
Thank you, Vaughn. So yeah, when we talk about our institution, diversity, inclusion, we are not inclusive as an organization. And a few examples, reg force and reserves. We create policy for the regular force, and we just think that the reserves are going to adapt it and make it happen. And we're not structured the same way. We don't operate the same way, and therefore it just goes there. I believe it goes beyond diversity and inclusion. We need to get a point where people belong to the organization. And until we hit that mark, I think we won't be there. Right? When you belong to the organization, you're not afraid to voice what you want to say. You're not afraid to be kicked out of the boys' club because you're part of it. Right? And as long as we want people to try to fit in and push in, we're not achieving the goals that we have to have. We want to build tough troops. That's our motto, right? We want to build tough. Well, when you have something that's tough and you apply pressure to it, it breaks. And if you look at the status of the armed forces right now, we have a lot of broken people, right? We need to build resilient troops. Because again, when you apply pressure to resiliency, it bounces back, right? And that's built through self-confidence, and it's built through making sure that people have confidence in where they go. It's about equipping our members with the right equipment, like Vaughn mentioned, right? We say that some of our members don't make it to the highest ranks of our organization. In a lot of cases, we break them before they get there. And the ones that we don't break decide to leave because they get fed up with not having the right standards, having the same opportunities as others. So we need to be able to look at that. I guess it all boils down to what we value and what we reward. Right? If we value loudership, not leadership, loudership, the loudest person in the room, that's the type of leadership you get. Right? If we value our members, then we're going to have the same type of equitable standards for promotion, and make sure that everybody's invited in the room, everybody's sitting at the table, and everybody has a voice and is heard at that table. And I believe that's where we need to get.
Awesome. If I could just have a follow-on question for Robert and Vaughn. So we've learned that there's a clear connection between health, culture, and operational effectiveness. Could you comment on that relationship in your organizations?
You go first.
I go? I could go. Okay. So, absolutely, it's all organized. So when we talk about the relationship between health and culture and how that links up to operational effectiveness, you just have to look at what we've been doing for the last 30, 35 years and how many members we have injured. You know, we just did an apology for Ada Beatty, 20,000 class action members that came forward, members that we have hurt, that we have destroyed basically in the course of 30 years. We're going through the Frenette class action right now, potentially 43,000 class action members. We don't know the outcome, what that's going to be like. And there's another 7 class actions in the pipe right now, right? So we've heard a lot of people throughout the years because of our culture, right? So when we talk about, you know, does it affect operational effectiveness? It absolutely does. And this is why we need to change it and make it better. You know, if we are to create a culture of health or a healthy culture within the organization, we are going to have healthy people. And healthy people is what we need to be able to deliver on operations and deliver across the CAF. So.
I could echo. Am I on here? I could echo many of the things you've just said in relation to the RCMP. I think many of us would say we're in a recruitment crisis, an HR crisis, and that's across, you know, a number of organizations in the sector, and you know, we've dealt with a number of very serious class actions as well. In terms of operational effectiveness, I think that's quite clear. If you don't have the people to do the job, you're going to suffer doing the job, and those who are there are taking on the burdens of doing the job because there aren't enough people. I think it's important too, though, that we, and I'm going to say maybe for myself, do a better job of clarifying the connection between sort of culture change initiatives and operational effectiveness writ large. So not just getting bodies in. You know, we had an executive retreat recently where we're sort of talking about our forward priorities. And Heather mentioned at the beginning this kind of fatigue of like, can we, you know, can we get back to ops? You know, that was kind of the message from like, can we talk about ops? And I think that's fair. We have a very important mandate as the RCMP, and people rely on us to do certain things, and those things are operational, so it's a fair comment. But what I kind of challenged my colleagues there to do is like, okay, so if our goal 5 years ago was to be modern, healthy, diverse, if our goal today is policing excellence, unpack that. What's underneath policing excellence? It's not just having equipment. It's not just, you know, having interest, you know, good legislation. People need to use that equipment. You know, people need to be, it all comes down to people. So whether your top line is policing excellence or your top line is healthy and diverse, I think the things that are going to get us there are all the people-focused things, but I think that it's incumbent, I think, maybe on, I'll say, people like me doing this work to make those connections a little bit clearer so that everyone can kind of see themselves in this approach and not feel that it's an attack on the organizations themselves, but that it's, you know, we're trying to take a holistic path forward that makes us excellent at our jobs.
Okay, so my last question is for Maya and Karen. Does research need to be designed from the ground up? And what is the researcher's responsibility? What do you see as being CIMVHR's role?
I'll take that one. I think when I think about whether research needs to be designed or redesigned from the ground up, I mean, clearly, yes, it's very important to be conscientious about that. In terms of whether we need to start from scratch, which is an assumption that I often hear, that everything that we've done in the past is not good, we need to do things entirely different. I would disagree with that, but one thing I would say is we need to change how we're doing research. So we need to take stock, we need to be very aware of what we've done in the past, and more importantly, we need to be able to communicate that outside of our research community. I think overall, as researchers, and I'm a defense scientist within national defense. I think I forgot to say that in my introduction. But you know, we work in very elite communities. We talk fairly well. We put a lot of effort into working across our elite communities, but less so in reaching outside of our community. So people don't know what we do. They don't know what to do with the research that we do often. So we need to work a lot harder. I mean, individual researchers obviously need to be paying close attention to things like gender-based analysis plus, inclusive processes from identifying the research question right through to communicating the research. But also within our institutions, I think that we need frameworks that create the conditions to do the research that needs to be done. And that means, I know publishing for all of us is extremely important, and I think that needs to continue, but I think we need to think about different ways of communicating research to different audiences, and maybe even doing research different in ways that actually speaks to what our audiences need, right? So where is the power within our organizations? In the Canadian Forces and National Defence, for example, it's not in the research community. Our power comes from the knowledge and experience that we gather from the individuals. So we need to shift that power focus from our elite research community and shift the power to the members that share their lives with us and with the organization. Thanks.
Yeah, so I, like Karen, I would say that responsibility lies with each individual researcher, with us as a kind of collective research community, and maybe especially lies with CIMVHR as the leading organization in this research area, to make sure that we produce research that can enable culture change or can support those efforts going on. And yes, that requires in part a redesign of research. But I think there's a bigger important point that I want to make here, and that is that you don't have to be doing research on culture change to be impacting the defense culture. So, I want to make sure that everyone realizes that I think, as a community, we produce research that either reproduces blind spots and biases that have existed historically, often unconsciously, I will say, or as a research community, we work to actively dismantle some of those biases and blind spots that exist historically. And so it doesn't matter, what your exact topic of interest is, but I think all of us can ask ourselves, how can our research be more inclusive? What voices or experiences are missing from our research agenda? And how is my research shaping the defense culture we're trying to change? I think that's a question we can all ask ourselves. And there's easy steps to do that. Vaughn already talked about Gender-Based Analysis Plus. That's an easy tool. Another one is Sex and Gender Equity Research Guidelines, which are sort of international research guidelines to help researchers think about sex and gender-related aspects in the research. CIMVHR adopted them in 2020, I think. Veterans Affairs Canada has adopted them as well. And so I think, for me, what's still missing is thinking about how can we improve education on things like Gender-Based Analysis Plus and Sex and Gender Equity Research Guidelines. How can we build more capacity around that? And how can we also ensure, work on quality assurance and on accountability? And I think that's a place where CIMVHR can play more of a role, because that's kind of the next step. You've adopted the guidelines now, but are they working? Are they doing what we set out to do with them? So that would be my suggestion for CIMVHR.
Wow. Excellent. So many thought-provoking ideas and suggestions from a great panel of experts. If I could ask each of you to just give one final piece of advice or a takeaway for the audience, whether they be a researcher or serving in the military or public safety, et cetera, what would that be?
Want me to start, Heather?
Sure.
Okay. My one piece of advice, I think, would be to give yourself time and space to continuously critically examine what you believe to be true. And I think this is at the individual level and at the institutional level. So, for example, when we think of an organization like the CAF and D&D, which operates values, assumptions are largely based on a strong, robust history, military history, let's re-examine that history and see if that history needs to be retold to set the conditions for the future. In our research, on a research level, it was mentioned earlier, I think Heather mentioned it, research, we strive to be objective, and I think most of us in graduate school, we have endless discussions about what that means, but then it drops at the door. We get our diploma, go into the research community, and don't really engage in that discussion. So critically examine what is objective. Are you doing objective research? And who's determining that it is objective? On whose terms is objectivity defined? The final thing related to this is just an anecdote that I'll leave you with from my military career. And this could be for leaders, researchers, not just anyone, for anyone. But I remember a very frustrated supervisor of mine, frustrated by me, by my, I guess, challenging and persistent questions, said to me, just remember, someday you're going to have someone just like you working for you, right? So I've remembered that, but what I remember is just like me, just like all of you, everyone has passion, perspective, and experience that needs to be heard. Thank you.
Tough act. Yeah. Tough act to follow, Karen. So in reflecting on the question, I think I'll echo in a slightly different way something that Karen said. I mean, my background is in gender-based analysis plus, which is really intersectional analysis. And I think, first of all, I'll say I've actually found GBA plus to be a really useful tool. It's been a very useful tool to come into the RCMP and have conversations that might be difficult conversations, but it gives a framework to those discussions, right? We're not just going to come in and talk about a scary topic. We're going to talk about it using sort of a lens of analysis that we can all learn and develop, sort of an instinct and a reflex to do, and it kind of becomes less scary to have the discussion. So I will say, if you're not, well, is everyone here familiar with GBA plus? Okay, so I've sort of done my job, and Karen's sort of done her job too, so that's good. But I'll say it's a useful tool. And the second thing I would say is, there are a lot of folks doing this type of work, but we become, like our organizations are siloed, and we become siloed, and I think that there's sort of a critical mass that we could probably be hitting more than we do to be making those connections. So Karen is always great in pulling me in, and I'm trying, but really reaching out and not reinventing wheels. I'll go to every conference I go to, somebody wants to, we're gonna look at our uniform policy, and I'm like, no, here you go, here's the thing, or we're gonna look at how to onboard trans employees. Here, we already have the thing. So I don't think we've done well enough as communities looking at these issues to like pull ourselves together and stop reinventing the same wheel. Part of that is because it's a hard wheel, and sometimes it's easier to stay in problem identification because it's a bit more comfortable than doing the work to do it. But those would be my two things. I think what GBA Plus brings is challenge your assumptions. Always challenge the things that you know when you're working into a problem, and GBA Plus is sort of a, give some rigor around how to do that. And secondly, make sure you reach out and find the people who are already doing this work. It'll save you a lot of time.
So in addition to some of the tools already mentioned, I'll mention an article that I published in the journal. Stephanie, I'm doing some more advertising for the Journal of Military Veteran and Family Health. So in 2021, I published an article called Equity in Military and Veteran Research. And in that article, I provided like a little toolkit. It was a one-page with sort of guiding questions that each person can ask themselves to help make their research more inclusive and diverse. So I'll just kind of mention that if you're looking for more tools or sort of a list of questions to help you, I think that's hopefully a helpful list there. The second thing I would say is that remember that this process we're engaged in, it's an ongoing learning process. Like you don't learn GBA Plus or how to do culture change sort of once and for all and then you're done. It's something we all are always engaged in learning about. And I think it's less about expertise. Like I don't really even feel that I'm much of an expert. It's about competency. And we're all trying to build our competency and our capacity collectively. That's what matters. To me, we can have individual expertise, but we really need to build that collective capacity. And I think part of that also is to not be afraid to make mistakes, to ask questions. We have to be really open to that, and I think only then we can collectively learn and move forward. And finally, I think, really every individual can make a difference in this field. I think a lot of individual acts will add up to something more systemic, and I think we can all contribute to making research more equitable and inclusive so that we do produce research that can be a foundation for culture change efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya, and you did raise some great points. Everybody did, and I guess it boils down to again, what we value and what we reward. We need to value research at the forefront. You know, we need to make sure that the research is applied well. We need to make sure that the research is measured. And after we read it, we need to really apply it to what we do every day. And sometimes that's the part, it's like in the armed forces, we have lessons learned. I think we should not call them lesson learned because we never really learn them, we just observe them, right? Every time something happens, it's in the drawer somewhere and we don't pull it out. And this is where we need to go. When it comes to research, there's great work being done. We need to pull it out, read it, not just read it, measure it, and apply it to our day-to-day work and to what we do. And this is how we're going to achieve the best success moving forward.
So I know we've talked a lot about biases this morning, and I'll admit to having one, because this is my very first CIMVHR Forum, but I think this was an awesome opening panel of experts. So that concludes the opening panel, but I encourage you to seek these people out. They will have their name tags back on after this. And thank you so much for your participation with us this morning.